First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, and especially Robert Maxwell, for giving me the opportunity to take part in this symposium. In 1418, King Sancho Sanchez de Oteiza ordered that he be buried in Santa Maria de Tudela in Navarra, in the grave that I have prepared. The will included an atypical disposition. If he were to be appointed to a position of greater dignity, he should be buried in the church to which he had been promoted, well, and with the honor that befits the decency of my person. 2 years later, he was elected Bishop of Pamplona. During the next 5 years, he concluded the southern nave of the cathedral and ordered his secular tomb. The events narrated so far permit the dating of 2 funerary representations of the same person, whose history is well known. They allow us to gauge the degree to which there was intention to individualize them by looking for physical resemblance or by other means. In Tudela, the delicate attitudes of the readers of both sides of the deceased, the painstaking portrait of the dean in his 50s, and the recent volumetry of all the figures make this an outstanding landmark in the introduction into the Iberian Peninsula of the Burgundian style of sculpture. The fixed stare, his glossy cheeks, and the short converging eyebrows in a protuberant forehead form a face with marked personality, in which are present all the signs of age and of an opulent life. On the Pamplona tomb, Don Sancho carried the bishop's staff, in contrast with Tudela, where he joins his hands in prayer. The imprint of time is perceptible on the countenance. The expression has become softer, the cheeks have lost firmness, and deep wrinkles mark the face. Both tombs lack an epitaph. The identification of the deceased, purely visual, is based on the clothing, the facial features, and the heraldic emblems. It is interesting to note that the armories are different, although they belong to the same person, and that less than a decade separates their creation. In Tudela, there was an inscription with 9 gold stars. The Pamplona tomb and the whole chapel is a display of heraldry. We find there a different emblem: silver close gules with the chains of Navarra canton with stars azure. The prelate has decided to show his social ascent by way of heraldry. The cross gules on a field argent represented the culmination of his ecclesiastical career. The gold chains attest to the king's recognition of his many years of service, and the stars remember his lineage. These 2 sculptures involve a radical advance. No previous ecclesiastical tomb in Navarra had attempted to reproduce personal features. Bishops Barbazan and Asiain, in the cloister of the Cathedral of Pamplona, mutual enemies and descendants of very different families, shared a bony, young demeanor. The recumbent figures of Oteiza transmit his life experience. Are we contemplating a requirement stipulated by the bishop? Is it the consequence of the new capabilities and artistic aspirations that were becoming widespread among the sculptors of the period? Does it correspond to a modification of certain Navarrese social milieu in early 15th century? Patrons, artists, and society constitute the vertices of the triangle in whose center lies the continuous search for physical resemblance and individual sculpture. Consider the antecedents. The Pamplona Cathedral cloister, one of the pinnacles of the European Catholic sculpture between 1280 and 1228, was built when the kings of France were also kings of Navarra. But once this period of splendor has passed, during the bellicose reign of Carlos II, the Bad, Navarra was unaffected by the progress being made in Paris under his cousin and mortal enemy, Charles the Wise. The circumstances changed when the Prince of Navarra, having been held hostage in the French capital between 1378 and 1381, personally came to know top-level commissions. The advances of André Bonneveu and other portrait artists made a definite impression on the cultured and sensitive young heir. In 1387, Carlos the Noble, Carlos III the Noble, acceded to the throne. On 3 occasions, he traveled to Paris to recuperate usurped realms and territories, taking advantage of his sojourns to acquire works of art and to hire first-rate artists. In November 1410, he spent almost a month in Dijon, where he probably obtained the services of Jean de Tournai, who had collaborated with Claude III on the tomb of Philip the Bold, that represented a landmark in the characterization of people with physical features, contrasting attitudes, and the impressive perception of interior life. In this way, in Navarra, between 1410 and 1425, there coincide a king desirous of incorporating into his domain the most advanced artistic manifestation of his time and the sculpture capable of satisfying his requirements. The tomb of Carlos III for the Cathedral of Pamplona was done between 1413 and 1419 in Olite, where the court resided. It depicts a sovereign of controlled temperament and attracted by splendor. Crown and mantle were the signs of royalty. The golden fleur-de-lis embroidered on the blue borders of the mantle proclaimed that he is a member of the French royal family. The quadrangular visage, prominent nose, and broad forehead confirm the intent of the representation to depict facial likeness. On the sides of the cushion, we can read his personal motto, Bonne foi. Thanks to Stephen Young, we know the names of Long's collaborators. It is enticing but not very rigorous to differentiate the working style simply based on their surnames, Jean de Lille, Michel de Reims, Jean de Bourgogne. Some of these sculptors would participate in other creations of individualizing interest, such as the tomb of Chancellor Villaspesa in Tudela. Here too, the artist plays at the service of the patron their ability to present the image that Don Frances desired. His unplumb face, not repeated in other tombs of the workshop, suggests that the coincidences between the recumbent figures and the relief of the family group in the upper frieze reproduce physiognomic characteristics of the Chancellor and his wife. The portrait of Villaspesa on the altarpiece of the same chapel is slightly different. He appears younger, his beard thin, richly clothed, and he wears a cap. The period of time that separates the realization of the altarpiece and the tomb does not justify details such as the change in facial proportions. One must think, rather, of the process of creating the work. Altarpieces were painted in the workshop and transported to their destination and assembled. The artist, Bonanata Ortiga, worked in Zaragoza, the painter, 90 kilometers far from Tudela. Perhaps he only saw the Chancellor when they agreed on the work, if it was Don Frances who commissioned it. Perhaps he never met him in person. On the other hand, Villaspesa resided in Olite, where Long's collaborators had habitually worked. Furthermore, the Aragonese painters of the international style and the society that they served did not always pay attention to physical likeness. Witness the representation of Isabel de Hue, very similar to the other feminine faces in the altarpiece, while her sculptured effigy was treated with an individualizing spirit seen in the blank face, the same one we see in the frieze and in her clothing. In the upper part of the Arcosolium, the Chancellor and his family attend the Mass of St. Gregory in what constitutes the first sculptural family portrait in Alvarez art. The sculptures repeated the facial sheens with little variations for the 3 daughters and from the grandchildren. In the lower part, a likely procession of ecclesiastics occupies the 3 sides. The sculptures differentiated clothing and attitudes, and they made an effort to capture the anecdotal, but there is no way of knowing whether they intended for the faces to resemble contemporary persons. 5 tombs of the group are of laymen of the court. Only Villaspesa is presented without armor. The hose and the shoe of his right leg are uncovered. The sword proclaims his condition of nobleman, but no other weapon marks him as a military man. The cap and the thick tone identify a man of letters. It was his intellectual background that permitted him to attain a position of such great responsibility. His epitaph reaffirms his doctoral status. Here lies Mosén Francés de Villaspesa, doctor, nobleman, and chancellor of Navarra. The other tomes of novels boast of the handling weapons and do not neglect to reflect their proximity to the crown. Arnau de Garro in Pamplona and Pérez de Andosilla in Olite wear complete armor and bear collars of chestnut leaves. A favorite gift of Carlos III, the lack of terms of comparison in its verification of their fidelity to likeness. Blanca, daughter and successor of Carlos III, inherited the taste for artistic productions. Around 1432, she commissioned the only surviving non-funerary sculpture portrait of a medieval Navarrese monarch. The queen is elegantly dressed and is shown before the Virgin and the Child. Her loose robes conceal her sides. The slimness of the neck makes us think of a slender lady, quite the contrary of the only literary testimony we have of her, which describes her in 1440 as obese and moving with difficulty. Did the sculptor want to disguise her corpulence? In her jaw, Doña Blanca had been praised for her fine figure. I'm inclined to think that her obesity was a consequence of her inactivity after the accident she suffered around 1433. The deterioration of the face does not permit any assessment of the physiognomy. One might think that the advances of the long workshop would attain broad social acceptance in Navarra and would be consolidated as a path of no return. This was not the case. There are no sculptural representations of contemporary personages between 1441 and the beginning of the 16th century. Following the death of Carlos III and Blanca, and with the disappearance of the artist as well, the genre died out. The tombs of the cathedral after 1430 have no recumbent sculptures. Neither are there any on the tombs of the Marshal in San Pedro de la Rua in Estella. The memory of the deceased was entrusted to coats of arms. We must ask ourselves whether there is other evidence to prove an interest in leaving a memory of the individual in the Navarre society of the period. The literature of that times reflects a scarce interest in describing people's physical appearance or character. The chronicles of García de Ubi and Lope de Roncesvalles, written before the tomb of Carlos III was commissioned, seldom mention personal traits. They give preference to lineage, relevant deeds, and the place of burial for its king. If anything, they insert brief commentaries on the character or virtue of certain monarchs. After all, physical appearance was not a merit of the individual. In contrast, we can consider what happened in Castile. Here, too, there were attributed to artists generally described as Burgundian the works that in the early decades of the 15th century showed individualized features. Nevertheless, as regards the patrons and specifically the royal ones, the panorama was completely different from that of Navarra. The monarchs of the Trastámara dynasty, established after the assassination of Pedro the Cruel, neglected the sculptural aspect of the royal tombs. Enrique II chose a burial site in the royal chapel that he had ordered to be built in the Cathedral of Toledo, near the miraculous Pillar of the Descent. His son, Juan I, made the same choice, but neither of the two gave any thought to monuments for their tombs. It was Enrique III who entrusted to artists established in Toledo the sepulchres of his grandparents, more than 2 decades after their deaths. The recumbent sculptures reproduce hardly any physical features other than the king's beard, but care is taken in the representation of the symbols of monarchical power, crown, scepter, and sword. We must not forget that the legitimacy obtained on the field of battle was questionable. The representation does not coincide with the description of the chronicler López de Ayala, quote, small in body but well formed, white and blonde. Although the gold of the hair seems to show to the present dark tone, possibly polychromed again when the tombs were transferred to the chapel of the New Kings in 1534. Likewise, we can perceive divergences between the literary and funerary portraits of Catalina Lancaster, the wife of Enrique III. According to Pérez de Guzmán, she was tall and very corpulent, ruddy and white. In the size and movement of her body, she seemed as much a man as a woman. The figure executed by Maestro Luis in the Queen's lifetime shows her very slender, with an extremely long neck and slim figure. Was the discrepancy between the literary and sculptural portrait due to the inability of the artist to personalize the bed, or to the patron's lack of interest in true physical representation? The face of Enrique III is especially anodyne. One might even think it has been remodeled. Nose, complexion, and hair differ from the description by Pérez de Guzmán. I quote, "He was white and blonde, the nose a little high. When he was 17 or 18, he had many serious illnesses that wasted his body and damaged his constitution, and in consequence his face was damaged and disfigured." The crown and sword contrast with the Franciscan habit and sandals, as was true of the recumbent figure of Sancho IV, who until then had been the only king buried in Toledo with a funerary statue. Traditionally, Master Luis has been associated with the worship of Ferran González, a painter and sculptor according to the inscription that he engraved on the tomb of Archbishop Tenorio in Toledo. The sculpture of the Archbishop and that of his collaborator Arias de Balboa seem more reliable with respect to likeness, but we cannot verify this. Pérez Figuera assigns a large number of work to the circle of this artist. Frequently, the deceased are only individualized by their coats of arms and by anecdotal details, such as the inclusion of collars with the names of dogs or decoration on the borders of the clothing. The faces of various ladies are especially lacking in definition. It is clear that a significant percentage of most important patrons of Castile and also the artists at their service had no interest in portraying portraitures in funerary sculpture of around 1400. The most outstanding exception is Gómez Manrique, illegitimate son of Pedro Manrique, royal favorite of Juan I and Adelantado Mayor of Castile. The legitimate heir's youth caused the king to appoint the bastard Gómez Manrique Adelantado, governor, a post he held for the rest of his life. His recumbent statue had traditionally been considered as commissioned by his wife Sancha de Rojas, shortly before her death in 1437. Her widow, aware of the realism of the face of the governor, who had died 20 years earlier, demanded an explanation, and his presumed solution was a funerary mask. In his will, dated in 1410, Gómez Manrique ordered that they bury my body in the main chapel that I am building in Santa María de Jerez del Val, in the alabaster sepulchre that I have had made there, in front of the high altar. But in spite of the explicitness of the document, the push to date this work in the first decade of the 15th century caused many authors to be unwilling to identify the tomb now in the Museum of Burgos with the one mentioned in the Testament. Recent historiography favors a reconsideration of the chronology. The markedly personal facial features of the governor, his sturdy build, aquiline nose, and broad forehead coincide exactly with Pérez de Guzmán's reference, quote, of a good head and strong members, dark and bald, a large face, a high nose. His ample full-length clothing, with no armor visible, is complemented by the sash of the Royal Castilian Order instituted by Alfonso XI, the collar of the Order of the Jab, created by the regent Fernando de Antequera, and the eye-catching turban that conceals his baldness. His attire proclaims his high social condition. The sash and the collar are an indication of the favor he found with the royal family. 3 sculptures have come down to us, which represent another illustrious personage of the period, Sancho de Rojas, Bishop of Valencia and Archbishop of Toledo. Each one shows different physical characteristics. In the Sagrario Chapel in the Cathedral of Valencia, the bishop is kneeling. The youthful face is the result of a geometricizing idealization. The continuous curve that connects the nose with the eyebrows, the smooth surface of the skin and the small mouth, as well as the perfection of the oval of the face make us suspect that we are not looking at a physiognomic portrait. Nothing in his attire, mitre, or posture indicates a desire to individualize. Identification was entrusted to the coats of arms situated in preferential places. Once in Toledo, Don Sancho initiated the construction of the new chapel of St. Peter, in which he chose to be buried. The first impression of contemplating the figure's prominent cheekbones and the thickness of the neck suggests a portrait likeness. Documentation proves that the sculpture was done in 1440, 18 years after his death. Unless there had been a death mask, it was not likely that the sculptor could faithfully reproduce the features of someone whom he had probably never known, even if he had worked from a painted representation. There was one of Rojas in Valladolid, now in the Museo del Prado. The same high cheekbones, the absence of eyebrows, eyelids reduced to a mere incision, and thinness of the face characterized the funerary representations of two other archbishops of Toledo, done around 1440 for the Chapel of Santiago. Both were of the family of Constable Álvaro de Luna, the patron of the chapel. Pedro de Luna was his uncle, and Juan de Cerezuela his half-brother. The head of the latter sculpture exaggerates the bone structure and the signs of aging, thereby obtaining the most personalized visage of the three, probably because it was the only one done during the life of the statue. If these three bishops, who were not related by blood, were represented with such a similar appearance, we can deduce that neither those who paid for the statues nor those who would see them expected veracity in their features. The third representation of Rojas forms part of a singular work. Along the access arch in the chapel of St. Peter in the Cathedral of Toledo are busts of mitred clergymen with the Archbishop on the top, at the top. The laudatory epitaph of the prelate displayed on the jambs, and his coat of arms on the tympans and archivolts lead us to the conclusion that the image was to represent this particular prelate and not the Archbishop of Toledo in the abstract. Above them is St. Peter in Cathedral, whose creation is documented in 1497. The inclusion of the head of the Roman Church half a century later would have served to mitigate the excessive protagonism enjoyed by a long-deceased archbishop and chapter. Parro had already explained that the half figures represented the 14 dignitaries in the chapter at that time. They were a coat of great richness and a plain mitre with no gold or jewels, apparel that they wore when the bishop celebrated a pontifical mass. What was the motive for this anomalous outpouring of portraiture? The bishops of the period led an itinerant life, especially those like Rojas, who occupied positions close to the monarchs. Their artistic commissions were entrusted to clergymen of lower rank, who remained in the main venues. It was they who hired the artists and supervised the work. Consequently, men who, on their own, would never have had the opportunity to the economic means to be protagonists, found themselves in a position to accede to unsuspected importance. It was a great opportunity for the second ranks. In Palencia and in Toledo, Sancho de Rojas had collaborators of this kind. In Palencia, matching the statue of Rojas praying is one of another clergyman. It is assumed that it is Pedro Esteban. You can see the coat of arms. Executor of the orders given by Rojas after being elected Archbishop Primate. In Toledo, in the Chapel of St. Peter, are preserved the funerary tablets of the Archdeacon of Calatrava and the Abbot of San Vicente de la Sierra. Both were doctors, and their chief merit resided in their bond of service with Rojas. According to the epitaphs, the former was servant and executor of the testament, and the latter servant and creation of the prelate. The Archdeacon of Calatrava, ninth in the chapter ranks, and the Abbot of San Vicente, 12th, must have urged the presentation of all of the dignitaries, a clever strategy in order for their respective images to appear in such a place of honor, and mainly in the figures of the two inferior clergymen with so individualized features. A paradox is evident. In Navarra, sculptural representations that gave attention to fidelity to facial features enjoyed wide acceptance, while the contemporary literature showed no signs of interest in these personality traits. In Castile, however, writers of classical training have provided physical description of the main characters in history since the 14th century, while sculptural depiction of individualized features came later. Late medieval Castilian literature produced a subgenre of the chronicle, that of the semblanzas, consisting of a summarized collection of particulars about personages at the social peak, in which sketches of their physical appearance and character were not lacking. This subgenre had its greatest representatives in the 15th century, with Fernando Pérez de Guzmán at their head, who wrote De Generaciones y Semblanzas around 1450, where he condensed 34 lives of monarchs, nobles, and prelates whom he had known. In most of the sketches, which often occupied only 1 or 2 pages, he included a few lines on the person's physical appearance. He is especially interested in the body and its strength, but also the face, of which he usually points out the color of the skin and the hair, as well as the size of the nose. The increase in physical description in the chronicles as the late Middle Ages advance contrasts in Castile with the parallel discredit of physiognomy as a means of knowing men's character. The Archpriest of Talavera shows that he is familiar with the old physiognomic text. He expressly cites the De Secretis Secretorum, but he gives no credit to them. In 1438 he writes, I quote, "You will read marvelous things about people's characteristics, but these rules are neither constant nor true, for which reason I shall not continue here, and so that on reading this, people may not become confused, saying to one another, now you have such and such a trait, and I have this other one. I will not continue. Furthermore, some are reddish and are good, and the same happens with other traits." Perhaps the critical attitude toward these physiognomic rules reflects a social predisposition that would end up favoring the generalization of sculptural portraits. I will end with a reflection on the social origin of those who commissioned sculptural representation of themselves. A large percentage of them were prelates of nobles raised to the highest position of the kingdom because of their services to the monarchs. Lira de Malquiel showed that in medieval Castile, renown among one's contemporaries and posthumous fame were acquired by battles and literary presence. The highest nobility accepted this convention, which perhaps was a factor in explaining why many powerful nobles gave no importance to the commissioning of funerary sculptures. On the other hand, those who, like Gómez Manrique or Sancho de Rojas, had attained a social relevance by way of personal careers, not exclusively based on war, might have felt more attracted by the ideas of leaving a memory of themselves, including their physical appearance, by means of sculptural tombs. This reasoning is valid for both Castile and Navarra, where tombs were commissioned especially by persons who had ascended the social scale, on their own merits. The examples par excellence were 2 bastards. Gómez Manrique, depicted on his tomb with all pomp, he who in his lifetime was, I quote, badly arrayed in his person, end of quote, according to the testimony of Pérez de Guzmán and Constable Álvaro de Luna, who commissioned his own bronze funerary sculpture destroyed in a popular uprising, and those of his family members who were archbishops. In summary, in Castile and Navarra, around 1400, the development of individualized sculptural representations was directly conditioned by the interest of patrons. Inscription and heraldic emblems satisfied a good part of their demand. The depiction of physical likeness depended secondly on the training and ability of the artist, as well as on the existence or not of the model at the time the work was executed. A significant percentage of the works with the greatest individualism church displayed a propagandistic intent at social advancement, and there is no proof of complete concurrence, no evolutionary line among literature, painting, and sculpture.